Without further ado, I'd like to introduce David Heinemeier Hansson, Jeremy Kemper, and Michael Kozarski from the Rails core team.
And actually, just for starting out, we're only three here today, which is actually kind of a little bit of a sham because as of late, we've been adding a bunch of people to the core group, which I think is deserves some recognition too. Pratik was added a while back, and we just added Josh Peak as well very recently. And those two guys have done phenomenal amount of work on the framework lately. There's really been a lot of activity going on, so I just want to give them a shout out and say we're really happy to have them on the team, and it's too bad they can't be here today, but yeah. I think otherwise we're ready to take questions on anything, everything Rails or not Rails. Come on, no questions. Or we can also just sit here and talk amongst ourselves. That'd be kind of cool. Actually, we could talk amongst ourselves until there's something. So one of the things we actually just been working on just now is we're going to put out a bunch of releases, 3 actually, during this conference. We just wrapped up 2.04, which is basically a bunch of bug fixes to the 2.0 branch that's been sitting around for
months.
Since May or something. And we're also going to put out 2.11. Which is, what were the major thing in 2.11?
Just an enormous number of backports, basically.
Right.
A huge number of fixes, which previously we probably wouldn't have bothered to pull in. The switch to Git has made that a little bit easier for us now. So we've backported almost all of the bug fixes, whereas previously maybe we'd have just done the ones which people were jumping up and down about.
Right.
Also, both 2.04 and 2.11 will include the DOS fix for RexML that we announced a while back, so it'll just be bundled as part of the application. So ideally, you've already applied those monkey patches or installed the gem, but if you haven't, if you update to the latest release as of tomorrow, which
so just if you weren't up to date on that, there was a denial of service vector open in RexML, where if you send a screwed up duck type as part of your XML request, you could basically take down a process. So that one's kind of important to deal with. So and for some reason they've just been kind of a little bit slow to take it upstream, which is why like RexML is really part of the Ruby distribution, but we use it and it's enabled by default on all Rails accounts. So it was perhaps a little hard to just sit on our fingers and wait for the Ruby package to kind of be updated with that stuff.
Right, but we did coordinate.
Sure.
I worked with Hugo on that and the guy who reported it to us.
Right. But I think that's another wonderful part of the whole Ruby thing, that we can just ship a monkey patch as part of Rails and we fix something in the Ruby standard library, and we can kind of protect people against that. We've done that a few times before. Like there was what was that thing? The CGI multi-part thing or something?
Yeah, that gem has been around forever. The multi-part end-of-file fix.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's definitely pretty cool that we can just fix it like that. It'd perhaps be kind of cool if we didn't need to fix it like that, but it is what it is, and for that part, it's pretty cool that it works like that.
Yeah, big credit goes out to Tarmo for doing the 2.1 stable backports, and Git has really come in very useful. We were kind of wondering before we made the switch to Git from Subversion what the differences would be both in our development philosophy and how it would change our interaction with others, and this is one of the things we've seen. Just so much easier to cherry pick changes and to take things from the master branch and treat them as stable and backport them. And he did a lot of work identifying all those things, and it turns out it really turns into a human issue instead of a technical one, where somebody has to look at all those patches and decide whether it's really applicable.
Yeah, I think there's no way we would have done 2-point releases and a major release, or even attempting to do that at the same time without Git cherry pick and just the ease of doing these things. I think in the past we've definitely been very fast to just kind of sideline major branches and not give them any updates. And I mean, now when it's so easy, I think there's a lot higher chance that we'll actually keep some of those major branches around for longer and just make sure that they're secure and bug fixed and so on. I think that the other thing of that is that it comes at a pretty good time, because I've seen a lot of people who aren't running the latest stuff anymore. So Rails is definitely at a phase where there's a lot of people who just they'll pick a version, say 2.0, that's what they built their app on, and then they're not in any big hurry to upgrade to 2.1 or 2.2 or whatever. Which is, I mean, I can kind of understand that. Of course, it'd be great if more people were faster to upgrade and get more of the new stuff, but when they're not, it's cool that we could at least still kind of support them without it being too much of a headache or a hassle to do.
Actually, I'm kind of curious, among you guys all here, how many of you are targeting Rails 2 with your current applications? Let's show of hands. And on 1.2? That's good, not many hands.
I have a 1.2 application, but... Well, you know, if it works, upgrading, while it may feel satisfying to us as developers to get some brand new thing, it's not necessarily the best use of our clients' time and money. You know, if the application is sitting there, it's working fine, solving their business needs. Sure. Maybe billing a couple of days to do a gem upgrade just isn't worth their time. Yeah, well, that's an interesting thing about sidelighting old branches. Saying 1.2 is still completely viable feature-wise. I know it's a stable branch, and there are a lot of things that haven't been backported to it. So there's still, and Git can make certain things easier, but it still takes a lot of energy to actually identify what to put back there and what really belongs. And is it still 1.2, or is it kind of 2.2 leaking backward in time?
And I think at some point you also just got to let go. I mean, we're not going to really keep 1.2 updated with bug fixes. I mean, if there's a
super... Oh, right, but why not? I mean, if it's so technically easy, right, it's a hassle.
And I mean, there is still hassle. So, I mean, currently, right now, it's just been... I don't think we're going to see a whole lot more of 2.0x. Like, this is probably kind of it. Like, so the plan would be that keep, like, the last one around. So keep 2.1 and 2.2 going at the same time. But, I mean, you can't keep supporting the older versions forever. Of course, you guys feel free to jump in at any point. Definitely a Q&A session, but we'll keep Q&Ing ourselves until you guys come up with some questions.
Am I live on this microphone? I can't tell.
You are not.
No. All right, I'll yell. Actually, I was going to offer to bring the microphone to people. That doesn't work. Come on up and ask questions.
There's another interesting aspect to me with the way we're rolling these out. And 2.0 took a lot longer to release. It was kind of in the works for ages after 1.2. And 2.1 came fairly quickly thereafter in comparison. And it was 2.0 was last December, and 2.1 was in end of May. And 2.2 we're actually getting ready for a beta release. So things are accelerating a little bit feature-wise. And seeing the uptake of 2.0, it actually took a while for everybody to kind of decide that get on board with that new direction. And so, you know, how many people are actually targeting 2.1 now? I mean, 2.1 is going to be the stable release going forward, and 2.0 is going to be, we're going to start forgetting about it. And with 2.2 coming so quickly here, and it kind of changes the pace at which you're keeping up with what Rails is doing. It reminds me more of the kind of 0.12 days where 0.12, 0.13 just kept rolling one after the other.
I think the good thing, though, too, is that it's not like we're rolling out new paradigm upon new paradigm. So the change from 1.2 to 2.0 was very substantial in the whole shift of the whole REST thing and so on. I mean, 1.2 had some of that, but in 2.0 was pretty much, this is kind of the way to do it.
It had the meat on the bones.
Right, exactly. So if you weren't still kind of yet sure if that was something you wanted to jump on, I could see some hesitation with that. But like 2.1 and 2.2, there's nothing philosophically you could be against. There's nothing controversial per se in those releases, I'd say.
Well, there's the thread safe stuff.
And partial updates in 2.1.
Yeah.
I don't think that's not on the line of the rest stuff.
It's not changing the way you develop your application.
Right, exactly. And I think that's pretty much the point is that like frequent releases are more easily adoptable when it's not like change everything you know kind of updates.
Yeah,
so.
And that's kind of a tension that we get with some members of the Rails community is there's a lot of really, really ugly code in Rails, Active Record especially, and older versions of Action View. And it would be awesome to just sit down and come up with this nice design and replace it.
Do you need that many releases?
Yeah, I do. and we could feel really good about ourselves. We could know that this design was great and it would be infinitely extensible and all of these kind of things. But in reality, what it would do is it would break everybody's applications.
Right.
And it would mean that people just wouldn't update to it at any given time. So,
yeah, I think there's definitely a shift in culture and just what we could do if we want people to upgrade. Because I think I've seen tons of frameworks in other languages who've kind of just said, well, screw it. We're just going to update, like Tapestry guys, for example. Like they've been very aggressive on some very major breakage upgrades that just left people, okay, I'm just going to use this old version forever.
It just makes it a new product instead.
Exactly. And then they're kind of competing against each other, which I think is pretty unfortunate.
Yeah, and Struts suffered the same thing. I think it was, 1.2, they released that.
Right.
And then they thought, let's rewrite everything from scratch, change all of our way that we do our designs. And
then if you're going to do that, maybe you should just do something else instead. Yeah. I think if you have large user base, you've got to have a somewhat conservative rollout of new major upgrades.
I think
I think we've reached critical mass on the question and answer line. So
now you're ignoring us.
Oh, just
you had your chance.
Sorry to interrupt you guys.
Yeah.
So this is a question about trends with Rails. I'd love to hear from each one of you. What do you think is really important that's happening with Rails that people maybe don't know that much about yet? What do you think is not good that's happening with Rails? And also, what's surprising to you that's happening with Rails?
Well, I can start with what's surprising. I'm trying to think of what's good and bad, but what's surprising to me is some of the folks from the community who just kind of pop up with great contributions. It's been a real, just very gratifying. Like Hong Lee coming out with Mod Rails and starting essentially a company around it. And we never heard of him before, and just kind of seeing a need and realizing he had the skills and just doing it. And it really didn't take too much work, but it took that kind of perspective on the work it takes to actually sit down and just do it. It's really nice to see. And what Josh and Pratik have been doing this summer, they've just been grinding away. There's just so much work that they've been putting into Rails itself. And I guess it's a surprise to see that Rails can be as quick and nimble on its feet again, even at this age.
I think one of the cool things I've seen is just like the focus on just some of the core elements of making a web application that we've started. Like we've always kind of cared about HTTP, but recently we've started caring about even more specific elements of it. I think one of the big new things in Rails 2.2 is going to be what Jeremy's going to talk about in his keynote, all the e-tagging support, the last modified support, all the support for using just more of the HTTP spec to make your application faster and use less CPU and so forth. I think that's just, it's great that we can keep chipping away at like something that it's been around for a very long time, but there hasn't been enough appreciation of.
Yeah, well, there's something about that kind of adoption curve too, where I've seen frameworks that look at HTTP as like a goal. I mean, having 100% compliance.
Right.
But it's more looking at your application and seeing how it can take advantage of being RESTful and really expanding itself to take advantage of those things that are in the spec. So rather than looking at the spec compliance as a feature, it's looking at what we can do with HTTP as a feature.
Right, I mean, it's the difference between standards compliance for a web application as your primary goal for making sure all of your markup is completely compliant with all of the relevant specs and making sure that you have an application that's actually usable for people, which is far more important. Yeah, useful, yeah. The whole question of what you're actually building in the first place is that much more important. I mean, I think one of the things that I found really satisfying about the Rails community is stuff which I come across in my consulting work. In the early days of Rails, David would have on the Rails blog sort of every single company that adopted Rails. It's, hey, check it out, Odeo is now building their site in Rails. I remember seeing that thinking, hey, that's awesome, man, Evan Williams, he's got all this money, that's really cool. Nowadays, you just come across all of these companies like yellowpages.com. I saw them in the guide at Portland for, surviving the big rewrite, how we rewrote yellowpages.com and Rails. What the hell? How did we miss this? It's this major announcement, but it's just this fact that the community is just completely self-sustaining and keeps growing like this. And so there's all these new people who get this new sort of experience of coming to a new web development framework that's actually optimized around making them happy. It's easy to forget that that's why we started doing this stuff in the first place. But when I sit down in the consulting work that I do and sort of mentor people who are just getting into Rails for the first time, watching them go, man, that is awesome, just some feature which you guys, no, we did that ages ago. That's just how it's done now.
Right. I think that at the same time, I think that's super cool, and I love discovering new companies who are doing all this stuff. But at the same time, I think some of that's a little bad is that this doesn't seem to be the same influx in kind of people popping out of the community to just contribute major stuff. Like we were talking about, like Ugly and like the mod Rails stuff, which is awesome when he pops out. But I mean, compared to the influx of people we're getting, compared to the amount of work that's being done on Rails, I think there's got to be tons of really cool stuff that's just sitting in people's personal vendor tiers, and they're just not. They're not packaging that up. They're not really sharing it. They're not feeling like, in some ways, connected enough to the community that it's natural for them to share that. I think that's a little bit of a shame. I wish that more people would kind of just share what they have. Like maybe there's not going to be like a huge amount of interest, but it didn't matter. I mean, lots of people, whenever they're starting something new, are just Googling. Is there a plugin for this? Is there a how-to for this? Is there something else for this? If everybody could just have that innate sense that, well, if I'm doing something that others have not already done, of course I'm just going to throw up a web page for it. It doesn't need to be a big thing. It doesn't need to have its own community. It doesn't need to have a release schedule or anything. Just sharing the code and making it Googleable I think it'd be great if there was more of that.
That's kind of the promise of GitHub, and everybody being able to have that kind of social aspect to the things that they're doing, the things they share, and it really reduces the cost of sharing.
Yeah, I guess it just takes people then to use it as well.
Yeah, and it's never really been a technical problem. I mean, before Git, you could use Subversion. It's not like it was hard.
Exactly. It wasn't really I think it's definitely more of a cultural thing. Whether you feel you have enough of connection to the community that it feels like the voice matters.
Or you value your own contribution.
Right.
I think we have another question.
Yeah, actually I have two questions, but I think I'll just get all the way to the back of the line.
Oh, let's go nuts. You can ask two questions.
Okay. Wow. Okay, the first one is, I would just like to have your input on the future of test unit, because a lot of people are switching to RSpec, and I think RSpec is great. It's really great help in development, and so are you planning on sticking with test unit, or are you planning on making a change at one point?
I'll make one quick comment about that. For me, the big part for the new testing frameworks were two things. Getting rid of underscores, so you don't have really, really long method names, and using the word should. And I think those two key innovations can be brought to something like test unit. In fact, in trunk and in 2.2, all tests are now test string with spaces and whatever you want, do end. So instead of being def test underscore whatever, I think this was Jay Fields came up with this simple little addition to test unit, which in my mind gave me the bulk of what I wanted out of like the improvements. Because I think there's definitely some cool stuff going on there, and it's great to have more readable tests and all that stuff. But for me personally, I got to say I'm not that. It doesn't fire me up, but it doesn't really matter. I think that it's wonderful that all these new test frameworks are out there, because for some people that's just what clicks. That's what gets them really fired up about testing and get them really engaged in testing. I mean, whatever floats your boat. It doesn't.
I mean, that made it. RSpec to me, it was sort of at the other side of that, whether or not the costs versus the benefits of it. Like, there were very big benefits, but at the same time, they'd rewritten the entire internals to use something completely differently, and it introduced bugs or differences in behavior, which at the time were kind of frustrating for me, and I didn't think that they were worth making that switch personally. But at the same time, I had a client last year and the year before, and there was essentially no testing there. Whenever I had built something for them, I'd come in, I'd write some functional tests and some unit tests, and I'd say, see, this is how this executes this thing. They were just like, yeah, that's nice. And then it would fail the moment they started changing things. But they tried out RSpec, and despite as frustrating as I found it working with it in those sort of early days, it's like, what the hell does this error mean? But they really loved it, and their application, by the time I stopped dealing with them about 6-8 months ago, was completely tested. So I don't think that there's anything yet which is sufficiently clear to say this is the obvious successor and it is better across all the possible axes of consideration. But I think it is now at the point where it's easy enough for people to do, you can choose whatever and you'll get the job done. Because I'm not an RSpec user, I don't know if there's anything that Rails, the framework, could do to maybe make that a little bit easier. I don't know if we could have make it easier for the RSpec on Rails plugin to integrate with our stuff better or change the generators. If there is, maybe we could look at that because, like I say, it is pretty much trying to choose whatever works. But
yeah, I think that's the thing where I think the position is on a lot of things. So people say Rails is not the database adapter agnostic, or it's not JavaScript library agnostic, or whatever. I mean, sure it is. It just has a default choice. And that default choice should really be treated as nothing more than just, if you don't care, this is what you get. If you care, awesome for you. Change that part out. And we want to do everything that should and could be done, that changing that part out is basically running single gem install or running a single command on something and then you change it out. Exactly the same thing with the template engines too. We ship with two. We ship with ERB and with Builder, but there's tons of them. And they're, in my mind, pretty damn easy to get up and running. It's very easy to install another template engine. And I think if it was just as easy on all the other fronts, like on the JavaScript library, on the testing library, on everything else, to plug in your own thing when you care, I think that'd be the perfect scenario. But I don't think that there's anything to be gained from removing the default choice. There's tons of people who come to Rails every day who doesn't have a preformed opinion about what JavaScript library should I use? What testing framework should I use? They just want something that's reasonable, that works, that other people have tried before them, and is good enough. And maybe after they've worked with it for 6 months or whatever, they come up with their own taste. And they see, yeah, I've tried Test Unit now, and RSpec is better for me. Fantastic, install it. But I think that the default choices, I like the simplicity of Test Unit. Test Unit basically doesn't do anything. Like, it's methods. And it runs those methods. So it's the absolute baseline of what could be. And I like it personally just at that baseline, but I also think it's a great default because it's such a low baseline. RSpec and a lot of these other things are just more involved. There's just more concepts. It's more complex to learn. But once you do, some people appreciate it. Fantastic. So for anything that's supposedly non-agnostic, find out what the non-agnostic part is. If there's something that's bothering the install of the gem or the library or whatever, send in a patch, and I'm sure it get applied very, very quickly.
I think on the difference between, sorry, David, between Test Unit and RSpec, there's this kind of implicit assumption that Test Unit is kind of old and moldy or something, and that the implementation is a little Byzantine, and so therefore Test Unit has some kind of flaw. I think Test Unit, what you're saying about just the simplicity of it, it's very accessible. The learning curve is super low. Thinking of assertions, I mean, it is a testing DSL. You're saying that I assert that this expectation, the expected value, is this, or matches this, or is less than this, or responds to this. It's very easy for people to understand. Whereas RSpec requires this kind of philosophical reworking, and then you have to also adopt this new vocabulary for stringing things together to look like an Englishy sentence. And I think that leads to, you have to look things up a lot more often than with Test Unit.
You have a second question you wanted to ask?
Yeah, just really quick. I was just interested in what you think is, to a degree, the future of some web applications, because at WWDC this year, I saw the presentation on Sprout Core.
Of what?
Sprout Core.
Uh-huh.
Have you heard of it? Yeah. So I thought that was really interesting to actually have an MVC kind of paradigm in the browser, that you actually have an app running in the browser and that it really just connects with the server whenever it needs anything. Do you think that that is a sensible approach to the future of engaging web apps, or what's your opinion?
I think there's some interesting aspects to building an application in that way, and it's certainly changing the way that a lot of people would think about, where do I put this logic? And but at the same time, it reminds me an awful lot of Java server faces and the ASP.NET server-side controls, which everybody uses when they start programming, but when they're actually building an application and the designer says, but I don't want it to look like that, I want it to look slightly differently, they want to customize the markup to work around some browser bug or any of those things, suddenly those frameworks start to get in the way a little bit more than something more sort of, MVC is the wrong word, but more sort of template-oriented like what we have is. So I think there's definitely some interesting stuff there. Trying to abstract away HTTP is a route for failure that a lot of people have taken and people will continue to take. I haven't built anything with Sprout Core, so I don't know how well it plays with all of that kind of stuff, if it just tries to post all to some crazy URL and sort itself out. It's interesting, but I guess I'm skeptical is what I'm getting at.
Yeah, it's actually agnostic of the back end. You just,
right, which means it views it as an implementation detail to try to abstract away. And this HTTP in the web is this platform that's created literally trillions of dollars in wealth and runs almost everything that we do on a daily basis. And to say, fuck that, I'm going to build something else. I might plug in, and I've got a web app now, maybe I'm going to point it at something else. I can't see that happening. And so I certainly think that Sprout Core is really interesting and a cool way of doing it. But the moment someone says, I can abstract it away and I can just talk over Corba or something as well, I get a little bit suspicious, I guess.
Well, I don't think that's their main selling point. But
no, not at all.
In any ways, I am not a particularly big fan. I think that a lot of these initiatives to move more of the logic to the browser are 10 years too late. Like, they were awesome if we were still all on 52K, 56K modems, and connectivity was getting worse and worse, or any of these factors that were true 10 years ago. I think they would have been way more relevant back then. In my mind, I don't think that sort of connectivity or the offline aspect, which I think is some of it, if you combine it with like the Google Gears and what have you, is really that interesting. Or the speed factor. I mean, I'm sure that there are some applications that will benefit from it, but I don't think it's a majority play for the web application. I think the web applications worked because they were at least equal part web and equal part application. And I'm seeing a lot of the run it all on the JavaScript end of things as the 90% application and 10% web in terms of having all the features of the browser just work and so forth. And in general, I was also not just a huge fan of the development experience. The more stuff you take out of Ruby, the more stuff I have to write in non-Ruby. And I mean, not nice. I'd like to write as much as I can in Ruby, which is what I think is a great strength of kind of integrated platforms like Ruby on Rails, where you write pretty much everything you can in Ruby.
I mean, the great thing is, all the generators, all that is in Ruby, in Sprout Core. So all the views, all that is you write all that in Ruby, and then it just generates, the view stuff for you once you run it.
Right. So. And I think that, again, gets into how much of this stuff can you actually generate. I think we've run into it ourselves, just seeing the limitation of RJS. Mm-hmm. Just generating very simple things, you very quickly run up against a wall there, in my mind. Or you bake in assumptions about how things look or how things feel that then have to be shared across all the applications. And I think that's kind of iffy. But I think it's awesome. I mean, who knows? Maybe 2 years from now, we'll all be writing web apps that way. And
people said convention over configuration was iffy and stupid as well.
Sure,
at the time,
exactly. So maybe this is just reactionary pushback from somebody who's used to write everything in Ruby on the server side. Entirely possible. But it just seems like we've kind of played this game for a while now. If not with Sprout Core, then with different similar techniques, and I'm not seeing that huge shift yet, but it may very well still come.
Yeah, I'm not sure actually. I think Sprout Core is probably the furthest along as far as integration with an actual web app framework on the server side, where it's at least trying to bridge the two rather than being the end-all be-all, actually put everything in the web page in JavaScript. And I think very few people have really pulled it off successfully, as far as the development experience goes, where you have to be a uber JavaScript guru to actually develop anything, which these days is still pretty difficult in the browser world. So I think they've done a pretty good job trying to bridge that gap, and especially the proof is in the pudding. I mean, seeing some of the applications they developed,
right.
And they're doing it successfully, and that's really the best measure of whether it's working well.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, so Rails 2.1 has the gem dependencies, and with that the idea of gem plugins, and I guess I just sort of wanted to ask, do you see that as being like the blessed way forward for plugins, and also is 2.2 going to be moving towards addressing some of the remaining issues with that, like rake tasks and picking up the initialization from unpacked gems in gem plugins?
Well, an interesting note is that plugins actually started out as gem stubs. And we probably would have used Ruby gems all along if Ruby gems had provided the API and support for having non-system gem installs. And it's still a bit crufty. We can experiment with having a gem repository in the application itself, which would be really nice and clean, but then not all the gem commands actually work with having a non-system install. You can't remove a gem from a directory that you specify, for example. But I think, especially given the fact that gems have already implemented all this stuff, the things surrounding dependencies and whatnot, that we never really wanted to see plugins grow up and try to duplicate what gems already do. So I think it's a pretty good direction if you need those features. But at the most basic level, plugins are so simple, most don't depend on each other, and keeping them simple is pretty valuable. So I don't think you're going to see that go away. So as far as a blessing goes, I think I'm blessing agnostic at this point. Oh, and as far as bugs, yeah, those need to be fixed. There's an outstanding bug on Lighthouse right now that Bruce Williams brought up soon after the 2.1 release, and a couple of other people have chimed in saying that they've had issues with it, but a patch is still forthcoming. So if anybody is actually seeing troubles with it, I encourage you to PDI.
Thanks.
What kind of influence have the up-and-coming Ruby-based frameworks like Merb and the Rack-based implementations had on the development of Rails core?
I think it's changed the kind of tone of the conversation, if you want to use kind of a political speak. Bringing up things like threading, bringing up performance of the framework itself as kind of, the pinnacle, I think has changed really what a lot of the Rails community is looking for out of a web application framework, because it seems like there's this competitor out there that's doing certain things better, and so it becomes a demand in kind of the community's mind to be able to do those things also. So there is some kind of light competition. I don't really know what else, though.
I mean, from my perspective, I'd prefer for us to be looking at building the best web framework that we can, rather than sitting there and just taking features from things. We go, oh, that's cool, we'll steal that, we'll steal that, we'll steal that, and end up with this kind of, I was going to say something that was not very nice to our Python programming friends, but something which is just kind of cobbled together with a whole bunch of sort of, with no overarching idea behind something. So I think there's definitely a lot of benefits to us in looking at what our, what you call them, our neighbors are doing. But at the same time, if we get too obsessed about, well, this guy has something that's 0.3% faster for this use case, then the road to hell is paved with that kind of stuff. I mean, we could sit there and get obsessed with the performance of our framework in a Hello World situation, but the thing about Hello World benchmarks is, in the big O notation, N is 1 with a Hello World application, and so it's thoroughly uninteresting for any kind of real-world performance benefits. I mean, your application is going to fetch something from a database, it's going to loop, it's going to do some string interpolation, it's not just going to render some kind of constant string. So I think, as with any kind of framework, and we did this to the Java guys as well, there's meat and then there's noise, and I get a little annoyed when people focus on the noise, especially when there is actually good stuff happening in these other frameworks, like the rack-based stuff and what's the other small one? Sinatra. Get clever small ideas for how to build really tiny applications, and you want to build some really simple case. There was some clever stuff there, but people it is so fast for Hello World applications you wouldn't believe, and who cares? No one cares.
Yeah, it's really, I think, missing the mark as far as what matters. Keeping the eye on the ball is for programmer happiness, for making web applications easier to build, more fun to build, and those kinds of things matter a lot more. And I think that's where something like Sinatra ending up focusing on page speed is really doing a disservice to Sinatra. And the real claim to fame for them is being able to have a simple one-page app. And pimping that is going to be a lot better than pimping, 500 requests per second more than some other framework.
I also think just that variety is great when there's variance. And I think that's what, a lot of good ideas start out like single good ideas and then just want to bolster it perhaps by that good idea and that reception, take on everything else. And then there's just a convergence of just the same stuff. And I find that a little bit uninteresting. I think that the more interesting thing is trying different directions and trying different approaches, trying different paradigms, or trying vastly different trade-offs. I think that's really where the meat is, and where we can add more of like a patchwork of things that are interesting for their own domains and specific things. Just trying to kind of get the same in slightly different packages is not so interesting in my mind. But I mean, at the same time, we've also had so many people come into the Ruby on Rails world and into the Ruby world in general that it's naive to think that there would forever just be like one thing, that there would ever just be one web framework. That was never gonna happen. That was never gonna pan out. If for no other reasons that people just have different personalities or things they want to focus on, or whatever you want to call it. There's some people just want to run their own stuff, and I, for one, can certainly sympathize with that. That's how I got started with this.
There were other web frameworks before Rails.
Right, exactly. So I think that part is just natural. I think that's just to be expected. So, I mean, I think it's good and bad. There's some great aspects with it. There's some I wouldn't even call it bad, just kind of, in my mind, futile or kind of useless of human productivity kind of aspects to it.
There's this atmosphere of like pissing contest.
Right.
And you can see where that atmosphere is and is not. And you can see like camping never had that atmosphere.
Right.
And a lot of that goes to why and the reasons that he was doing it and the coolness of it. And it was its own thing, rather than being this kind of reaction to Rails.
Yeah, I guess if you define yourself in terms of what you are not, then it's strikes me that it's not a particularly happy place to be, because if the thing which you're so opposed to can fix that issue, or people just don't actually care about that thing, you've got nothing left. There's no positive thing to grow there. And
what about wasn't the 15-minute video? Look at what I'm not doing. Defining yourself by what you're not. Never mind.
We were happy.
Look at what I'm not saying.
Yeah, look at us being happy, I guess would be the way to put it there. And that was his video too. I had nothing to do with that.
Okay, we have another question.
This is a question about Ruby implementations, and looking at the recent MRI releases and also the JRuby work, what's coming with Rubinius, what do you see the Ruby of Rails? What is the Ruby platform going forward? What should we look at and use mainly? Do you have any?
And don't forget, we have a whole symposium on that question coming up, so don't give it all away.
I'd love to tell you, but you'll have to find out tomorrow. My personal customers, almost all of them are on 1.8.6 various patch levels. I don't even know what patch levels they're running. I had one client in New Zealand who was running JRuby in production. They're a government department, so I can't work for them when I'm in another country. It'll be interesting if I come back if they're still on JRuby. I know they were looking at it again, but I think one of the things I found really interesting about the most recent RailsConf we had in Portland is that there was no talk just, hey, check it out, this is JRuby, it can run your Rails application, because that ceased being used sort of 18 months ago. Of course JRuby can run a Rails application. It's a real Ruby implementation. From where I'm standing now, Rubinius is not yet at that point. When it does, then maybe my clients will look at it. And similarly, what's the .NET thing called? Iron Ruby. if it crosses that point as well, then it's something that we can start talking about and experimenting with. But if I'm just talking about what my customers use, it's almost all Matz's Ruby, and so that's what I test, that's what I run on my laptop. I do some JRuby testing, especially for the thread-safe stuff, but if you don't have a compelling reason to look at something else, then I think it would be an interesting decision to do so.
Yeah, I'm really curious to see, too, how these Rubies differentiate. And JRuby has often been talked up as, you're in the JVM, so it's a familiar world. You can deploy it places where the JVM is already accepted. You can run other things in that JVM. And that's really a very limited pitch for JRuby. It's saying that, hey, we're here for legacy. And that's not exciting. I think JRuby it's a full-fledged Ruby implementation, and it should be considered a peer. And I think all the Ruby implementations will probably end up at that point. So I'll be curious to see why people choose one over another. In other cases like maglev, I'm getting all this interest in having a distributed persistent object store. And maybe that's why people will choose maglev. Maybe it's because it's purportedly super, super fast. But yeah, it's up to these Rubies to compete amongst each other. And I don't know what points on which they'll compete.
Is Ruby 1.8.7 going to be the platform for 2.2, or will we continue to work on 1.8.6 the best, which seems what everybody's using?
Yeah, I think actually 1.8.7 is really, it's incompatible with all Rails releases except 2.1 and later. It introduces a bunch of breaking changes, which you'll find out about later. And I think we'll support as much of 1.8 as we can. And if we don't support something in 1.8.6 or even 1.8.5 or 1.8.4 in some cases, I'd probably consider it a bug.
Yeah, especially what used to drive a lot of that stuff was patches from people running Debian stable, which of course is Debian ancient if you were being like an honest name. It was running 1.8.2 for an extremely long time. And so, I'd commit something, I was running it on my laptop with 1.8.4, which came from, 2005? So I had test pass, yeah, right, cool, commit it. And then someone would pipe up, oh, you broke my deploy on Debian stable and here's a patch to fix it. Hopefully that will continue. People will pick up the Rubiniuses of the world and start noticing, oh, well, you broke this, it used to work, but it doesn't now. But I guess one of the challenges is, of course, it has to get to the point where there was a stable enough base for people to be able to pick it up and start running.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, too, where Ruby Spec is really probably the platform that we're targeting. And Ruby Spec is coming up with a kind of an acceptance suite for Ruby implementations. So you can actually check and see for each Ruby, do all the tests pass? Is this a real Ruby language? Is it a partial implementation? Do certain things work and certain things just completely blow up? And we weren't able to really tell before because there was no spec. But Rails can target that spec, and then you can be sure that it'll run on any Ruby implementation that also satisfies it.
At the same time, that leads us down the same path that we have with compliance testing for the HTTP spec. It's like, well, technically this is actually a bug in Matz's Ruby, but 99.97% of Rails users are running that. Maybe we would accept that particular
misbehavior. Right, I think that's definitely going to, Matz's Ruby is going to set the tone for a very, very long time. That's always going to be like, or not always, but for the very foreseeable future, going to be like the default implementation that everybody follows. But at the same time, it's also kind of, I don't think the reception to 1.8.7 have been that of wild cheer. And I think maybe 1.8.7 will just be seeing kind of, I think it was 1.8.3, which was kind of like just a release that was kind of skipped in some sense.
We didn't run on 1.8.3 for a very long time.
Well, we don't run on 1.8.3. Right. I think we specifically say 1.8.3 doesn't work with Rails. 1.8.7 will, but it's just kind of interesting sometimes. I think that's the most polite word to use about like that process, how some of these things happened. Where maybe there are perfectly valid reasons and we're just not good enough to spot them, but I'm certainly having a hard time sometimes seeing like the reasoning going on for like the 1.8.7 stuff bringing back a ton of 1.8.9 stuff.
We'll talk on Monday. On what day is it today? Yeah, we will. Yeah, definitely want to go into that.
Right. Yeah. All right.
I mean,
Okay.
Next question.
Hi. Just be curious to know which technologies, frameworks, programming languages you're playing around with and see potential in. And if you're going to be doing Rails and Ruby in 5 years and 10 years, or are you going to find something that's really interesting? Maybe you don't have to switch, but just anything you find interesting, and maybe you can take a concept.
As someone who is a Rails consultant, Rails is perfect, and the more of you that use it, the better.
Okay.
I find I've always been really interested in some of the alternative approaches to object persistence and data storage. Like, I'm a big object orientation fan. The fact that it lives in a database, it's kind of cool because it means I can run incremental backups, whereas if I'm just running it to a big serialized file, I've got to back up 40 gigs worth of data every night. But I'm really interested in what's coming out of the CouchDBs, the HBase, and Facebook released this thing, Project Cassandra, which seems to be HBase if you didn't know that HBase already existed. So I don't know what their plan is there, because I also know they use HBase in production. So there's a whole bunch of interesting alternative persistence technologies in terms of the storage, and then of course when you're working with them you have a completely different kind of API to work with. So I'm really interested in people who are experimenting in that kind of area and seeing what they can come up with, and yeah, that stuff just fascinates me and I keep my eye on it. As far as the web side of web applications, I'm pretty happy with Action Controller, and Action View does the job for me now. I mean, it could be better, it could be faster, it could be cleaner code, all of that kind of stuff. But fundamentally, I'm not seeing anything there that's making me think, God, I wish I had something else. But with persistence technologies, all the time.
I think one of the things I'm kind of interested too is just the whole platform, the whole cloud thing. I think it's really interesting. I'm very much looking forward to the day where we don't have to buy dedicated machines for ourselves. I think the whole image thing is really a fantastic way forward. And at 37 Signals, we're currently running everything on Zen servers. So we're having multiple VMs run on the same physical machine. And it just seems like the last part of actually having those physical machines, it seems like just such a kind of waste. Why do we have to kind of take care of that stuff? So I love Jeff Bezos' whole thought on like having physical machines is like generating your own electricity. I mean, people used to do that 100 years ago. They have their own generators and running their own power plants, but it just seems like it's just nonsense these days. So I can't wait until that happens. And I hope that a lot of the stuff that comes along with that, we've kind of started that conversation, a year or two ago. Like, once we have the VM images, can't we do more to standardize some of these things? Why does it still take a sysadministrator time to put together his own image, set up all these things? In my mind, it's so much easier if there was just the Rails app server and it just came with a standard distribution, because I don't care.
Well, I mean, there is actually.
There's a lot of attempts at this. I'm just not seeing that kind of thing. Just like it hasn't swept the floor.
Definitely, hasn't seen much adoption. There's the Rails stack,
right?
Which is a standard image for running Rails.
And I think part of why it's not seeing that adoption is that everybody's still running their own machines.
Yep.
And as long as that's the case, I think people are just going to be too attached for this kind of stuff. When the whole cloud thing grows up a bit and everybody starts using it, I think it's going to be so much more of a non-brainer that you're just going to share these things. They're just a software configuration. We share software configuration for everything else. Why wouldn't we just have these default things? And why do everybody has to set this stuff up from scratch?
I think a lot of that system administrator culture, and sysadmins need to be infected with convention over configuration also.
Oh yeah. I mean, the idea that it can take you more than nothing to set up a new server when I already have sort of 6 working app servers and I want a 7th?
Well, I think that some admins are probably pretty good about doing that within their own farm.
Right.
But there's not a whole lot of cross-pollination going on,
right.
Which just seems like a waste.
I guess the other kind of thing which is interesting is the Google app servers of the world. I find that an interesting model in that it's this cloud thing and it's taken care of. But if you can't see from like just first glance that is just a honking great lock-in to Google, I mean, it will not run anywhere else.
Right.
So there's
not excited about that at all.
Yeah, just because it's on the cloud doesn't mean it's automatically good.
Right.
Like the nice thing about EC2 is that
point.
it's more or less Zen images. They have some proprietary technology for the block storage and what powers SimpleDB and all that stuff. But I can take my app server, I can figure out how to use some other distributed file system like GFS if it wasn't so flaky, and I would be able to use that and run my database servers off that, and everyone would be happy.
Having something where you could basically just slap like an active record-ish thing on top and not care about whether you're necessarily running MySQL or Postgres, or care about it, but care about it on the same level as we care about what database we run. We kind of care about it because there's like replication and there's the backup part and so on, but we're not really writing a MySQL application. We're not writing a Postgres application most of the time. We might do some spot optimizations, and that should be kind of how it was or it is with running on a VM. It should be spot optimizations from now you're running on EC2. They have these few things. Let's take advantage of that. Yeah, anyway.
Okay, Alan.
Something a wee bit different. I just wanted to talk about conferences. Giles Bowkett had a post recently about RailsConf and keeping RailsConf weird and regional conferences. And since we have an American and a European and someone weird and regional, we'd maybe talk a wee bit about the differences in feel between the American RailsConf, the European one, and regional conferences that you've been to.
Sure. I'll be extremely biased and say that my visit to Scotland on Rails was one of the best small conferences that I've ever been to. It was fantastic, and you should talk with Alan about that later on. It was, I guess, what I find really interesting about coming to any of these conferences is that having a chance to meet with people who are using Rails for a living. Like, you know, the fact that there's more than 5 people using code that I wrote in production on a daily basis is really bloody cool, and the fact that all of us in the same room is cool as well. But what I find especially nice about the smaller sized conferences, and this is smaller than the US conferences, so it has some of these benefits as well, is that it's slightly less frantic. Like if you stood outside the keynote hall in Portland this year, it was just a zoo. There were people everywhere, and so I'd sort of get out and go, I want a drink of water, and run to the thing. But here, it's a lot less like that, and you can sit down, you can have conversations with people. And with regional and smaller conferences, it's the same again. And also giving new people a chance to speak. You know, apart from this, I'm not speaking this year. You know, most of you heard me. I'm kind of boring in the greater scheme of things. It's nice to give other people opportunities to do that, and regional conferences are a fantastic opportunity for that.
I think it's awesome to have both ends of the spectrum. I love the big show that's going on in the RailsConf US, because it's just a way of where we get a critical mass of a ton of people doing Rails together. And there's just I think a special energy of not necessarily talking to everybody, but just being part of a crowd like that. If you're at a concert and there's like a ton of people really into it, that's a special experience. And it's also a special experience going to a small ceremony, like 30 people listening at somebody with a guitar. I think both of those ends work really well. And I think it's very important that we have both of them. It shouldn't just all be mega conferences, but I think they very much have their place. You get different kinds of energy out of them. But it's definitely different. It's different things, and I think it's also different atmospheres here in Europe versus the U.S. The U.S. is just more of that big blockbuster kind of mentality, and I mean, I think that's great on many levels. I'm not against it. I don't think that just because there's a lot of people it went soft. Or in many ways, I think actually the RailsConf we had in the U.S. this year was the best of the ones we've had in the U.S. It had the best content, and that came in part because I think there was something like 400 or 500 applications to speak, and there were, 80 slots or something? It was going to be a very, very high content rate there. It's going to be really high quality. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that the other 300 applications weren't good. So it's just, that works for smaller conferences too, that there's that many people who want to speak. They should definitely have that opportunity to do so. So it's all great.
Just before Jeremy, I'll just clarify, I'm not raging against big conferences, because I had a really good time in Portland too. It's just a very different feel.
It definitely is. It definitely is. And you've got to go into it with that understood. I think you can very easily go into RailsConf in the US and kind of be disappointed. We didn't all sit together around a round table and hack. Like I think the first RubyConf I was at was in 2001 or something?
The Virginia one?
Yeah,
that was
I think
2004.
So. Oh, really?
The first one I was at was 2001.
Oh, really? Oh, well, yeah, we haven't been around for that long. But even then, 2004, that's even more incredible. We were how many people?
I think that year we had about 65 people, and that was
right.
big.
And that felt like everybody almost could sit about, a really big table. Yeah. But it had a special feeling. And there's so much to really like about that, and you just can't take that expectation to a RailsConf US, or even here. I mean, the difference between 65 people and 400 is still vastly different. So I think people will just do best to kind of have the expectations to match from home.
I had one last question, and I say last because we're going to wrap up in a few minutes. But I just had one question myself, and that is, do you all feel that there is one or more sweet spots for Rails applications? And I don't mean in terms of scale. Let's just give scale a rest for a minute. But I'm just curious because I have, I sort of get certain impressions when I'm doing consulting and training, that certain kinds of situations, and not just public-facing, but intra-organizational uses of Rails. I mean, I just kind of get my own sort of intuitive feel of what I think sweet spots are, kind of, and people ask me, is this a good thing for Rails? And pretty rarely do I just say no, but I just kind of feel my way toward it. I was just wondering if you had any sort of formulations or thoughts about the sweet spots for Rails applications in terms of domain, in terms of organization, and so on.
I've said no a few times to people who've sort of retained me to come in and see if Rails would be a good fit. And in almost all of those cases, it was not because they had some super complicated application or some need for really advanced persistence technology or to work with DB2390 or anything like that. It was just that either their organization wasn't ready, so their real problem was that they didn't know what they were building, and they were trying to ship specs to their developers, and they just they were 9 months behind on that, and they were worried that the 1-year project was going to be all taken up with development time. It's like, well, your time's gone. But others have just been organizations where there are already a passionate team of, say, Python or Perl or Java programmers. And I've had a few customers who have said, Rails is fast, Rails is better, and we want to switch to Rails. And I come in and I'm treated like this kind of leper combined with some kind of conspirator, because I realize that their team are all really passionate Python programmers or Java programmers, and the advice in those situations is generally, what are you thinking? Listen to your development team. They're the ones who are going to make the biggest difference there. So in my experience, I guess maybe it's just the domains that I deal with. I've not yet come across an application where I thought, nope, no way, not going to use Rails on a purely technical or a domain basis. It's just been organizational stuff. Are they ready for it? Do their team actually want it? And will it solve the problems that they really have rather than the problems that they think they have?
Yeah, I think that's definitely at any point where you go in thinking that anything is going to be a silver bullet and solve all of your issues if you're 9 months behind schedule. It's just not going to happen. Mm-hmm. And I'd much rather that people didn't try to push Rails in those scenarios, because that's just going to lead to them souring on it altogether, not because of Rails, but because of the situation it was put in. But I think that's true for most anything. I think there's very few web environments, popular web environments, that can't be used to do anything. And I mean, even the sweet spot thing, again, it's very rarely I find the sweet spot thing to be about technical issues. Much more about personality and culture.
Yeah, I see the sweet spot pretty similarly, where it's a pretty wide spot because it's a very versatile tool. And I think that when things start creeping outside of the sweet spot, you have to start asking why. And is this a web application?
Right.
Is it something users are interacting with over the web? And kind of take a step back and look at what you're actually doing. And if you're making, say, a message bus, then maybe you should be using a message queue. But if you're doing a web application that people are actually hitting in browsers, then you're in the sweet spot.
All right. Well, thank you very much. We appreciate it.